listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Let's talk. And I am Halli Casser-Jayne. Welcome to my listeners in the United States and around the world. Tune in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show at hallicasser-jayne.com. This week on the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, two beloved authors. Up first, a legend in his own time, the former esteemed editor of Simon Schuster, now noted author and historian, here to talk about his new book, Alone, and reflect on his extraordinary life, Michael Korda. And following our conversation, I chat with the delightful and insightful Ken Follett in a fun, freewheeling interview. His book, A Column of Fire, surging on the New York Times fiction bestseller list for good reason. What a show. Let's get to it. Michael Korda once said, "Some people are so famous that the legends about them and the cultural aftermath of their life altogether obscure the real human being." I doubt he was talking about himself when he made the statement, but it is fair to make it today. Korda, in a word, is a legend in his own time. The best-selling author of a host of books that include Hero, Clouds of Glory, and The Extraordinary Charmed Lives, Korda has witnessed many remarkable events in the 20th century, not to mention edited presidents, world figures, and newsmakers during his esteemed tenure at Simon Schuster. Born in London, Korda is the son of English actress Gertrude Musgrove and the Hungarian Jewish artist and film production designer Vincent Korda. He is the nephew of film magnate Sir Alexander Korda and brother Zoltan Korda. Korda grew up in England but received part of his education in France. As a child, he also lived in the United States from 1941 to 1946. He was educated at private schools in Switzerland and read history at Oxford. But it is his witness to history as a young boy, as a bystander across the Channel, coming of age in the heady, confusing, exciting, terrifying early days of World War II, that serves as the backdrop of his latest book, Alone, Britain, Churchill, and Dunkirk, Defeat into Victory. That is a stunning, eye-opening, heartwarming recounting of a world going mad and the figures and consequences of Hitler's blitzkrieg into Belgium, France, and the Netherlands in May of 1940. Let's talk. Hi, Michael.
Hi, Halli. How are you?
I'm fabulous, darling. How about you?
Okay, thank you.
Oh, good. Nice to have you here. So let's get to it. I got so many questions to ask you, I can't begin to know where to start. Let's start with this, though. Why now, Michael? Why visit all of this now? I'm always curious when writers pick up a subject, why this one at this moment? Your childhood certainly is a part of this history, and you as a young boy growing up in this looming war, and Churchill is coming together about the same time you are. So talk to me about why.
Well, I was 6 when the war began in September of 1939, and 7 when Dunkirk took place. Of course, as a child, I don't have a direct input into those events because I saw them as a child. But it nevertheless fills in the background and connects the dots for me in writing about the first year of the war and the evacuation of Dunkirk, because I can remember so much from that period. And I not only knew as a child, knows a grown-up, people who were on the beach at Dunkirk and came back from it. But my mother went down to give sandwiches and beers to soldiers as they came on the trains back from the ports in the south of England, soaking wet without their boots or their helmets. So the period is very vivid in my mind, and I think it was a great help to me in writing Alone, because it's both an account of the events that led up to Dunkirk and an account of what it was like to be in England at the time when we were, in fact, after the collapse of Belgium, Holland, and France, alone.
Interesting to me. I once asked a Holocaust survivor this question. I'm going to ask you too. When she looked back, I asked her, do you see this in color or do you see it in black and white? You know, people of my generation, which is a little younger than yours, we see it in black and white because we only knew the war through movies. What about you? Do you see that when you look back, when you're visualing, is the visualization color or black and white?
I think I see it in black and white. I would agree with you. But, I think that's a trick because we see the newsreels and we see any pictures of that period as being in black and white, then our memory of it tends to become black and white. But you're perfectly right that I remember those events in black and white. But I think that's a trick of the mind and the eye, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, but I also think
surprisingly enough, when they're I'm sorry.
No, you go.
On the rare occasions when color film was used, it seems perfectly natural.
Yeah, I have to think about that. But I do think it's interesting because I do think black and white colors even how we emote over those times. Talk to me about this. In Alone, Britain, Churchill, let's get this title out again and again and again, and so people pick up the book, and Dunkirk, Defeat into Victory. You chronicle the mounting diplomatic failures and military miscalculations of England as she woke from being an island, I think as you actually wrote, an appeasement to what can be described as the plucky Churchillian nation of blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Set up for me this transition, what you recount in Alone. Talk to me about that particular moment when things start to change for the UK.
Well, I think that the whole country was, to an extent that's difficult for people to visualize today, prepared emotionally and spiritually, if not physically, for war to break out. I remember being fitted for a gas mask, which we all had to carry at all times. In 1939, before the beginning of war, and anti-aircraft trenches being dug in Hampstead Heath across the street from our house in Hampstead, and the government did amazing things. I mean, not useful, but amazing. They ordered and stored at critical points hundreds of thousands of cardboard coffins. And printed over 1 million death certificates because they anticipated that the first week of the war would produce hundreds of thousands of casualties from bombing and gas attacks, which of course never happened. So, but the effect of that was to make us aware that war was very likely coming. It was sort of some miracle of negotiation at the last moment, which never took place. And I very much wanted to describe that as part of the background for Alone and Dunkirk. That enormous anticipation of the event prepared the British public, I think, for what was to come, and I think made an enormous difference, because the critical reality of Dunkirk is that once we separated our army from the continent and managed to get it back in this amazing 4 days with over 800 or 900 small boats, the smallest of which was 14 foot 4 inches long, the British settled behind the white cliffs of Dover, and were actually relieved and pleased that they were suddenly alone and without allies. I end the book with a wonderful letter from the king to his mother, Queen Mary, saying how relieved he was that France had surrendered, because now we have no ally to pamper and pay attention to. And that's a remarkably English thing to say.
Now, speaking of a remarkably English thing to say, first of all, can I just tell you something? I listened to you talk all day long. I love your voice. I just wanted you to know that.
You're very kind.
You're a great voice. But listen to me about this. For the next years, the soundtrack of London would be the wailing air raid sirens. And here you are. You're telling me you're 6 years old. All of this is going on around you. You remember the gas masks being distributed. Oh, my God. I can kind of relate back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Was fear your pablum?
No, I don't. I don't think so. You know, I found the whole experience of the first year of the war thrilling rather than frightening, and also I think children tend not only to be excited and thrilled by what's going on, but also have a very high perception of how nice it is to break one's routine and be plunged into a whole new world in which there seems to be no routine, because at the beginning of the war, the British evacuated nearly 2.5 million children from London and the major cities in the south of England to places in the north of England in anticipation of heavy bombing. So, as children, we were being shunted back and forth constantly. And that's, while uncomfortable, it's interesting and exciting. Needless to say, beyond a certain point, events become frightening rather than exciting. But I never quite reached that point in 1940, and I remember it as being, immensely exciting with a lot of traveling. But I think that I picked up on the general feeling of what was happening and what was going on, and the sense that big events were taking place. I remember being, and I describe it alone, sitting down to hear Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain tell us that we were at war with Germany. I remember sitting down solemnly around the dining room table to listen to Churchill's first speech on the radio. I remember, as I say, people who came back from the beach at Dunkirk. So one had the sense of being part of great events.
Yeah, and I think that also might have to do with your parents, which we'll talk about your parents in a bit. But because how one's parents set things up for you, I think, is how one perceives the world. Some people would have put it into fear. It sounds to me like yours had a wonderful, innate sense of adventure. You certainly have lived that life. Let's talk about this cast of characters. Neville Chamberlain.
I never saw Neville Chamberlain in the flesh, as it were. I try in alone, to be fair to everybody except perhaps Hitler. And Neville, and while I never met Neville Chamberlain, I remember him speaking on the radio to tell us that we were at war. And in the book, I reflect on Chamberlain's qualities. He's blamed for giving way to Hitler over the Czech crisis in 1938, the Munich crisis, as it's constantly called. But the truth of the matter is that Chamberlain knew perfectly well that Britain was not ready for war in 1938, and France certainly was not. And therefore, there was really nothing he could do but accommodate himself to Churchill. After which he drew what is now called a line in the sand, except that there's not much sand in Europe, around Poland. And when Poland was invaded, Chamberlain fairly promptly declared war on Germany, which is exactly, of course, what he never hoped to see happen. So I think one has to see Chamberlain as not as a weak man. I know he and his umbrella are taken as routinely as signs of weakness and giving in. He was actually a very tough, shrewd politician, rather like Lyndon Johnson, but he was arrogant, and he regarded his own view on anything as absolutely correct and morally right, and he did not take advice easily from anybody. So his fault was not weakness, it was vanity. But I tried to be as fair to everybody as I can in Alone, and I think that's an important thing, because I give full attention to the Belgians and the Dutch and the French, who certainly were overrun and surrendered. But then, why would they not? We had the option, we the British, of retreating to Dunkirk with some hope of getting back to England. They did not. And it's difficult for people today to imagine what it was like in the second week of May 1940, when there were 2,500,000 refugees on the road from Belgium, from Holland, and from eastern France, spread out on the roads without any food, without any water, without any gas for their cars, if they had a car, farmers with their cattle.
Gee, it sounds like Puerto Rico.
But under fire.
Right.
Imagine doing all that, first of all, with no relief agencies or anything else in sight to help them, because there could not be, and nobody had ever predicted that anything like this would happen. And secondly, they were constantly under fire from the air, shelled and bombed and machine gunned. This was an event that let loose on the roads of Europe 2,500,000 people with nowhere to go, and with nobody to look after them or even tell them what to do. I wanted to convey in Alone the magnitude of those events.
Well, I think you certainly did that. Are you there? Listen to me about this too. The thing about Chamberlain that I would say to you is that he seems to be the man everybody loves to hate. You know?
Yes, that's true. But you have to bear in mind that everybody in the world hailed him as a hero in 1938 when he settled the Czech crisis by handing the Sudetenland over to Hitler, including the New York Times and including the President of the United States. Everybody regarded that as a brilliant and courageous move to prevent war. The fact of the matter is it did not prevent war because Hitler's demands were insatiable. And even if you gave in to one demand, then that would merely take you to a point where there would be another demand in the future, which would be even more impossible to meet. And Chamberlain certainly never understood that. And the critical factor of Alone is that although Winston Churchill could be wrong and was wrong about a lot of things, he was always right about Hitler. From 1933 on, he absolutely understood in a way that nobody else did that the dangers of Hitler and of Nazism in Germany, and spoke out on it constantly, and brought it home to people who didn't want to hear.
Different times, different people, different characters, different character. You say character, and then you bring in a man like Winston Churchill. I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but I do need to. I'm curious as to your thoughts on him after all the research that you did for this book. What are your feelings? Flawed or just human?
Well, everybody is flawed. To be human is to be flawed. But I met Churchill frequently when I was a child. Now, I have to say, I'm conscious that the word "met" is probably the incorrect one. He worked for my uncle Alexander Korda, the movie producer, in the 30s, because the Churchill ship could only be kept afloat by a vast tide of money, since Churchill never changed his living habits and style to suit his income. And those who believed in Churchill, including my uncle Alex and my father, made sure that ship was kept afloat. He read scripts for my uncle Alex, and my uncle Alex bought the motion picture rights to all of Churchill's books. So I frequently met Churchill, which is, I never had conversations with him because he was not a man to waste time speaking to a 6-year-old child, including his own, and let alone other people's. And I went to school with his grandson, who was really one of my best friends until his untimely death a few years ago. So I have a personal sense of Churchill, which makes him not seem a familiar, remote historical figure to me, but a real and living person. And I don't think anything can match the exuberance and the self-confidence and the drive of Churchill's character. His was certainly the most forceful personality that I have ever encountered, both in person and in print. He was quite remarkable, and he understood from the beginning that the great issue was that we could never surrender. As he said, and it's not that I take the title, we shall never surrender. We will fight on, if necessary, for years, if necessary, alone. And that's where I took the title from, because of course that was the Churchillian view, and Churchill managed not to impose that view on the British public, but to embrace that as the British point of view. As he said after the war, the British public was the lion, I was merely the roar.
Amazing man. I love reading his stuff. I love reading about him. You can never get enough of Winston Churchill, no matter how.
Oh, he's amazing.
Really, right? And we don't even have men like that anymore, or women. Different times, different things. Which brings me to this. I do want to take you out a little bit on a different path for a moment or two here, and that is, you had a crazy life as a child. I mean, my God, you were surrounded by all these great artists, production designer Vincent Korda, your uncle, and his brother Zoltan Alexander Korda. You brought it up. Merle Oberon for a time, I think, was your aunt, right?
Yeah.
For those who
Merle Oberon was my aunt. Yeah.
Right. Kathy in Wuthering Heights. For those who want to put her name with a face. You wrote a terrific book, by the way, Charmed Lives. I love that book. I'm interested in your thoughts on those times when they were filmmakers bigger than life and politicians bigger than life and stars whose light shined with blinding brightness. And now we have Hollywood and filmmaking today. What your thoughts?
Well, I don't know that much about Hollywood and filmmaking today. I mean, I only know about the world I grew up in, and that was in the 30s and 40s. And the movie business looks like a very different business today, as why would it not? I mean, think of the changes in technology and the changes in the relationship between movie stars and the studios. The whole thing is, and yet, there's a saying in French, plus ça change, plus ça même chose. The more things change,
the more they stay the same.
the more they remain the same. And the truth of the matter is that the movie business remains what it has always been, which is that a movie must provide a spectacle, number one, a story, number two, and a star, number three. And those three elements are the elements necessary for a successful film. They were when films were in black and white and silent. They were in the 1930s and 1940s when my family was making them, and they still are today.
I just don't think we have stars today.
Sorry?
I don't think we have stars today. We have personalities today, and that's a loss, I think. But that
I'm not good on the stars today.
Yeah,
I'm too old. I mean,
I don't think so. But go ahead. Age is only a number.
I'm lucky to have reached Clint Eastwood or Kevin Costner. I'm not up on the latest stars, but you see, there too, nothing has changed. The extravagance, the huge amounts of money, the crazy demands that stars make. Those are true now. They have always been true. My uncle Alexander Korda got Marlene Dietrich, who was an old friend who had first appeared in one of his films in Berlin in 1928, to come over to England in 1936 or 7 and make Night Without Armor with Robert Donat. And when she saw the first rushes in the screening room afterwards, Marlene Dietrich complained, in German, of course, to my uncle Alex, that she didn't think that the close-ups were as good as she expected them to be. And my uncle Alex gave a long sigh and took her hand and said, my dear Marlene, I'm afraid we have to face facts. Your cameraman is getting older.
What a wonderful line. Oh, my God. She must have hit him.
But the thing is that nothing really has changed about movie stardom. It's still the same. It's still a question of how well you photograph, and the fact that technologically speaking, photography has come a long way from what it was then. Doesn't change the fact that the camera picks certain faces and they work on film, and other people who may look in the flesh to be quite beautiful don't photograph as well, but movie stars photograph well, or they don't become movie stars.
Right. My thought on it is there's a lot of style right now, not a lot of substance. I'm moving ahead quickly. Listen to me. Simon and Schuster, 40 years. Names like William Scherer, Will and Ariel Durant, Harold Robbins, oh my God, Irving Wallace. You worked with Nixon, Reagan. Are you kidding me? I mean, really, I'd like to spend about 2 weeks with you, just sitting and looking at you, maybe sharing a glass of wine. Let's talk, darling. We don't have 2 weeks. Happy with the publishing industry?
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, let's do it. Happy with the publishing industry? Where it is today? Talent rising to the top as it should? Or I bet you have something to say about this.
But, once again, I don't think, to be honest with you, that anything has changed. the background and the technology of publishing books is of course not only has changed, but is in the process of changing even more quickly. And some of those changes are distressing and difficult to deal with. But the fact of the matter is that as I read books, and I don't read as many books as I would like to, that the same things are still happening. Anybody who is a good storyteller is going to sell a lot of copies of his books. Now, if you take somebody like Don Wilcox, who wrote The Force and The Cartels, both of them novels which I picked up, I couldn't put down. I just had to read them right to the end and finish them. He would have been, I think, an enormous success and number one bestseller 10 years ago and 20 years ago. I think if Harold Robbins were alive today and writing novels, he might need to jazz those novels up in some way because they would seem a little old-fashioned otherwise. But the critical factor has always been and always will be storytelling. And that goes for fiction and nonfiction. And one of the things I try to do in Alone is to tell accurately the history of that first year of the war and with the culmination, the climax of it being the evacuation of the British Army from Dunkirk. But it should not only be good history and correct history, it should be a story which you want to read from page to page. The reader has to say at the end of every chapter, "Oh, I'm just going to read a few more pages." If you don't feel that about a book, then something is wrong with the book, because that's what a novel has to do, and it's what a nonfiction book has to do as well.
I think that's really interesting. Can that be taught, or is that a gift? Can you mold that?
I think it's mostly a gift. I mean, you can give certain I was going to say lessons, but that's probably the wrong word. I mean, you can tell people over and over again, show don't tell, which is what all of us who have been in book publishing for years always tell novelists. Don't tell what is happening, show what is happening.
Right.
But some people can do that by instinct. Some people can do it if they're writing out a shopping list. It will come out as a story.
and on the toilet paper.
Yeah, exactly. And that instinct, the ability to do that, and in nonfiction, the ability to do that with elaborate historical material and characters, that's a very real gift that you're born with or not born with. And if you take David McCullough, every one of David McCullough's best-selling nonfiction books,
you don't think you're reading nonfiction.
Is about a subject that could, in fact, be very dull. If somebody said to you, write a biography of Harry Truman, lots of people could produce a perfectly historically accurate biography of Harry Truman. But what makes David McCullough a unique number one best-selling phenomenon is that he can tell the story of Harry Truman in a book that remains a story where you want to read it from page to page to the very end. Even though you know what happened, you want to get there and find out. It's as if you'd never heard the end of the story before. And that is, I think, the essential thing that every book has to do.
I'm going to mention Graham Greene, your good friend, The Power and the Glory, The Quiet American, The End of the Affair. Long time friends, the two of you. Do you know today's his birthday? You would have been 113.
Well, I was a friend of Graham. Once again, I want to put that in perspective. I was a teenager when I first met Graham Greene, and we became very dear friends. And he was a great friend of my father's and a very close friend of my Uncle Alex's. So he was like a super family friend, and I admired him. I thought he was one of the most intoxicating personalities I've ever known. When I went into book publishing, I had no idea that I would end up being his editor as well. But when I did, it was one of the great things that happened to me in my career is that I ended up publishing a substantial number of books by Graham Greene, and that was one of the great pleasures of my life because we enjoyed each other's companies. We had been friends despite the difference in age for many years, and to suddenly end up publishing him and doing his books was really one of the best moments of my rather long career in book publishing.
We only have a few minutes left. I have two questions. Let's get back to Alone, to 1940, World War II, men like Churchill, operations like Dunkirk. Do we glorify the men, the events, the times when we look back, Michael? And if we do, is there danger in that? And I want to just say this. I know at the moment, for instance, Holocaust historical fiction is very much in vogue. But there is a certain romanticism that seeps into that writing. How do you feel about all of that as we look back? Do we have to be careful?
Yeah, I think so. I think you're absolutely right about that. Actually, I think that there's a combination of factors you have to bring to a nonfiction subject like this. One of them is a sense of detail. The other is the ability to pick personalities that are interesting. I mean, Winston Churchill, obviously, on a very large scale, is interesting. But you have to find people whose diaries and whose letters give you not only an insight into what happened, but represent a very, very interesting view that thrills us still today. And there are several people in the book whose diaries and letters I use, who saw every moment of the retreat to Dunkirk and of the beaches, and describe it in their own words as seen by their own eyes in ways that are completely fresh and give you the sense of being there. That's actually one of the most difficult things to do, is to find those people. Once you have, then you have a way of not only telling the story, but showing what happened in a way that's absolutely fresh and hits the reader hard with things that are brilliantly described as somebody saw them on the spot. Those are the priceless things in history. Finding those things is what matters most.
So speaking of history, this your 11th hour of a very long and storied life. I hope you'll be around a whole lot longer, Michael. From your perch, not having only been a witness to so much of history, but I think an historical figure, I'm going to say this in your own right. You are history, darling. Leave us with a... Well, it's true.
I will hope I hope I will get to write a lot more history. I'm not absolutely sure, but
but you yourself are history. You have become an historical figure. You represent a time and a part of our culture that few can in the way that you do. So I'm going to say to you, on leaving this wonderful conversation, thanks so much for spending so much time with me. Leave us with words of wisdom from on high. What do you want to see in the world of the arts, in culture, in history, going forward, that we don't make mistakes? Is there something? Am I throwing something out at you too broad for you to zero in on? Create, darling, create.
I'm giving that question. I think I actually am seeing very often what I do want to see. I'd be very interested, assuming I live long enough, to read the histories of this particular period in our lives. I just as Bob Caro, whom I hugely admire, has managed to rekindle many people's interest in Lyndon Johnson, and just as Ken Burns' series on Vietnam, which I find riveting, is reawakening in people old enough all the feelings that were involved there, and showing, I think, younger people who would not have known necessarily that much about it, exactly what did happen and what happened to the country as a result. I would be very curious to see, to live long enough to see how history is written about the 4 years we're in the present. You can't get that day-to-day from the newspapers. You have to live until somebody does that kind of research and writes that kind of book. It'll be very interesting to see what they have to say.
All I can say is I can't imagine.
Neither could I.
Michael Korda.
Somewhere out there's somebody who will do it.
Yeah, right. It's going to be something. It'll be 400,000 pages long and have to be edited also, because boy, oh boy, every day is a tome. Darling, you are wonderful. Thank you so much. You are a gift. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm very happy to have had a chance to talk to you about Low.
I've been speaking with Michael Korda. His new book is Alone, Britain, Churchill, and Dunkirk, Defeat into Victory. For more information, visit Amazon.com. You are listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. My guests today are New York Times bestselling authors Michael Korda and Ken Follett. Tune in to the Halli Casser-Jayne podcast. Nearly 300 episodes available at hallicasser-jayne.com. We'll be back in a minute. Stay with us. Hi, this is Halli Casser-Jayne. Are you enjoying the show? I hope so. And I hope that you'll tell your friends about it and help us grow our family. How can you help? That's easy. Share the link to the show with your friends or my show's player. And I would love it even more if you'd recommend they visit my website at hallicasser-jayne.com. I look forward to seeing all of you there. One of the world's best-loved authors, selling more than 160 million copies of his 30 books, Ken Follett's first bestseller was Eye of the Needle, a spy story set in the Second World War. Many of his books have reached number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list, including Edge of Eternity, Fall of Giants, A Dangerous Fortune, The Key to Rebecca, Lie Down with Lions, Triple, Winter of the World, and World Without End. Now Ken Follett is out with a gripping new story, A Column of Fire, A Little History. In 1989, Ken Follett published the historical epic The Pillars of the Earth, a departure for the best-selling writer, which stunned readers and critics alike with its ambitious scope and unforgettable cast of characters. It reached number 1 on bestseller lists around the world. Oprah selected The Pillars of the Earth for her book club. Then came the second book in the Kingbridge series, World Without End. Together, the 2 books in the series have sold 38 million copies. Now, the saga continues with Follett's new epic, A Column of Fire. Set during one of the most turbulent and revolutionary times in history, A Column of Fire begins in 1558, where the ancient stones of Kingsbridge Cathedral look down on a city torn apart by religious conflict. As power in England shifts precariously between Catholics and Protestants, high principles clash bloodily with friendship, loyalty, and love. Column of Fire charts the star-crossed romance between Ned Willard and Marjorie Fitzgerald over half a century. Meanwhile, Europe turns against England when Elizabeth Tudor becomes queen and finds herself beset by plots to dethrone her that will lead to the beginning of the British Secret Service that eventually gave us James Bond. But the real enemies, then as now, are not the rival religions. The true battle pitches those who believe in tolerance and compromise against the tyrants who would impose their ideas on everyone else, no matter what the cost. Let's talk. Hi, Ken. How are you today?
Pretty good, Hallie. How are you?
I'm great. Are you having a good time?
I'm having a pretty good time. I'm in New York City and doing interviews and talking about my book.
And that's a good thing.
All in all, I'm in good shape.
Well, good.
Yeah.
So let's talk about A Column of Fire. But I have to ask you a question before we get into the book. Talk to me about this, about your staggering success. Do you feel worthy of it? Do you find it all a bit odd? Or do you say to yourself, I earned it? You have an enormous success. How does that feel?
Well, it feels pretty good, and I've had some luck, but I tried very hard. I go to great lengths to write a story that will draw people in and intrigue them and make them want to turn the pages. I have friends who are writers who say, well, I write to please myself, and then if other people like it, that's great news. And I have never talked that way about my work. I've always tried to write something that people would really enjoy, would give people a really memorable reading experience. And so while I've got to admit that now and again I've had some luck, Oprah Winfrey picking The Pillars of the Earth as her choice, that was pretty lucky. I was very pleased about that. But I've also got to be honest with you and say, actually, I'm successful because I work so darn hard at it.
I like the way that sounds. And I'm glad you're honest enough to admit it. A lot of people don't want to do that. But then let's go here with that just for a second. Just play this out with me because it does, I don't know, it's something that I always think about. And that is, you get to a point after writing for as long as you have and I don't say that it becomes a formula, because God knows you're one of the few writers who's broken your own formula. You went from one thing to something completely different, and you did it successfully. But do you know what your reader wants from you, and do you think about that while you are creating?
All the time. I think all the time. As I'm writing, will people like this? Will they believe that this could really have happened? Will they be interested in how this turns out? Will they want this character to succeed? Will they hate this bad character so much that they can't wait for me to kill him in the story? I think all the time about how readers are experiencing this. It's absolutely the most important. The key for me is that the readers must share the emotions of the characters in the story. And if they do that, if you care, if you're reading my book and you're worried about this character, is she going to be okay? Or you hate this character and why don't they arrest that guy, you're saying? Or if you're on the edge of the seat, or if tears come to your eyes reading my story, you know this isn't a true story, don't you? You know Follett made it up. Tears come to your eyes. If you have, readers have that reaction to the story, that's what I want. And if they do, then they will remember the story, they'll love it, and they'll say to the friends, I just read this great book, you've got to read it.
So now that's interesting to me, because I really did some background on you. And you fascinate me. So I'm going down the psychological road with you. I hope you don't mind.
This is very flattering.
Well, it happens to be utterly true too. But here's, I read something that you wrote. You're talking about playing the guitar, and you said one is something, I ask you that for reasons, is writing the thing that you do best. And the reason why I did it was because it came out of what you wrote on your website about playing the guitar. You said, I've always played the guitar quite badly. And I think it's quite important to have something that you do badly, especially if you are an overachiever type of personality like myself. And that interested me about you. You also talk about the fact that you think you're a thoughtful writer, not so much an emotional writer. Playing guitar is certainly an emotional thing. Now you're saying to me you want to elicit from your readers emotion, but I guess that takes having the mind create that for your reader. Yes?
Yes, indeed. So of course, the story, writing the story, creating the story is cerebral. It's got to be logical. One thing's got to happen because another thing happens. And the decisions people make can't be crazy decisions. They've got to be decisions that, even if a decision ultimately gets the character into trouble, it's got to seem like a rational decision in the first place. But then, of course, on top of all that rational stuff, what really gets you is how this character is feeling. The character's fear or hope, or love or hatred or ambition, all of these things. And also, my principal characters are never like James Bond. James Bond has no parents, no children, no brothers and sisters, no cousins, all right? He has no family. My characters always come from a family, because what also happens, not only is the character worried or frightened, but his mother is worried about him, or his kids are worried about him, or his brother is worried about him. And it's that network of people, for me, that helps to create the emotions surrounding the plot.
Time, space, character, you get it all in there. It's pretty interesting. It is what makes your book so readable. Column of Fire, perfect title for your book. I got to ask you a question. By the way, great woman characters. Again, what's with you and women? You do them better than any. I mean, it's adorable. I mean, how do you get there? How do you know women so well? That's what I want to know. But here's also where I wanted to go with that. It's you and spies. Come on, Ken. What's with you and spies? What's this fascination? Where'd this all come from for you?
Well, there's something. Spies are always being deceitful, so they're always in danger of being found out, and so that creates suspense all the time. But the other thing about spies is when something happens in history or in politics, in world affairs, something happens, there's an official story about it, which isn't true. And we're always interested in what's the real story, what really happened. We love that sort of thing, don't we? That's what we want to know, what really happened. What was really said, in the Kremlin or in the White House or in Peking, Beijing. What's and spies, of course, know the real story because that's where they are. They're in the secret world. They know all the secrets. And, that's where they live. And so when we look at some great historical event through the eyes of spies, we see the backstory. We see the hidden story behind it all. And we also are with this person who is constantly in danger because there's always a fear that people are going to find out what he really is.
It's very cute because extraordinarily self-aware and self-control. You'd have to be a spy, right? You must.
Yes.
Right? So if you're not a writer or a guitar player for a great band, would you have been a spy?
Well, I'm maybe I wouldn't have been too bad at it, but here's the problem for me. Spy organizations are generally pretty conservative, and I've always been pretty liberal, as you can probably tell from my books.
Of course.
And I'm not sure that I have a suspicion that MI5 and MI6 would have looked at my record and the demonstrations I went on when I was a university student and would have said, we're not having this guy. He's some kind of lefty.
And a 60s kid, by the way, too. And that's something that's now playing into your writing a lot because you are, what did you call it? Somebody called you or you called yourself a champagne socialist. Oh my God, I love it.
Yes,
that was the best line I think I've read in years. But it's true. But here's the deal. You at this point, you are writing about characters and particularly Column of Fire, Welsh coal miners, Russian factory workers, Jews, African Americans, religious freedom, which is certainly the subject of this book. Why now?
Yes, and I'm interested in people in history who have fought for freedom. That's the thing that really gets me going. And it's because if we think about it, freedom's kind of unusual. Most people in history have lived under a tyranny. Many people in the world today live under a tyranny. And I'm intrigued by the question, how did we get so lucky? How did this happen? And so looking at the past and identifying moments when people fought for freedom. For example, when the women fought for the vote, nobody wanted to give it. All the men were in power. They didn't want to give them it. Somehow the women won that political battle. Or in my last book, Edge of Eternity, part of that was the story of how African Americans fought for civil rights in the 1960s. And when people fight a battle like that and win, for me, that is a great story. I interviewed Congressman John Lewis, who in the 60s was a student leader, leading protests, got his skull cracked by a policeman's baton in Mississippi back in the 1960s. I said to him, you ran a brilliant campaign. How did you get so smart? You were 20 years old. Of course, he said, I wasn't smart, but we had the right philosophy, was what he said. But I think they were incredible. And that turns me on, that story of how downtrodden people just stood up for what they were entitled to and won the political battle. That's the kind of thing that turns me on. So in recent years, I've written a lot of stories about people fighting for their freedom. And in the 16th century, what they're fighting for is religious freedom, the freedom to worship as they want to, as they believe is right, not as the king tells them.
Yeah, Ken.
And that's the kind of thing that gets me going.
Yeah, 1558, 2017. I don't know. Are things all that different? You've been to America lately?
I know what you're saying.
Right?
I know what you're saying. We still have religious conflict. We still have religious violence. But I believe we're making, at least in principle, we believe, don't we? That in Western Europe and North America, governments believe that religious freedom is a basic fundamental right. And back in 1558, almost nobody believed that. People who believed that were considered wild radicals.
Yeah, well, interesting. You think that there come a time when you say, enough, I'm done. I think I'll become a carnival barker or who knows what. writing, I'm finished?
There's no sign of it. I'm still enjoying it as much as I always did. I still find it challenging and fascinating. And, you know, I tell myself that after finishing a book, I should take 2 weeks off. But after about 10 days, I start thinking, oh, you know, I know what might be a good story to do next. And I'm back into it. It's too interesting to take a long holiday from it.
And is part of the fascination that it's not something you easily master? It's kind of like your guitar. You keep working at it.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, if it was easy, if writing novels was easy, then I think it would, you know, it'd be possible to get bored with it. No, it's difficult. It's difficult. It's very complex. You have to keep it all in your head, and you have to focus on not just getting it right, getting the history right, making it a logical plot, but you also have to focus on what is the reader going to feel about this? Will the reader care about this? Will the reader want a certain outcome from this scene? And that it's a relentless focus. If you want to do it well, if you want to do popular fiction well, you've got to have a relentless focus on the reader's progress from page to page and what the reader is feeling about everything. And so all of this is, you know, it's not easy, and thank goodness, because if it was easy, I'd probably be bored.
Yeah, I hear you about that. I surely do. So if you hadn't become a successful author or a famous guitar player or Ken, a spy, what might have you become?
What would be my number 4 choice? You know, when I finished, when I graduated from college, one of the jobs I was offered was with a company called International Computers Limited, and this is at a time when computers were a very new thing. And if I'd taken that job and if I'd been good at it, you know what? I might be Bill Gates.
There you go. You know, it's interesting to me. I mean, I don't know. I'm glad that you're not Bill Gates, though. I like you better in the role that you're playing now, and so I can pick up your books every once in a while and have a really good, fun time with them and learn, by the way, which is one of the reasons I like your book so much. So maybe Bill Gates, okay. Ever too late to create new dreams or listen to me? Is that why you write books? Because you're always creating new dreams?
Yeah, but that is exactly what it's about. Yes, it's imagining new dreams. Yes, it's also about putting them into a form where people can share them. But yes, you have to have the dreams first. So what's next? Well, I finished A Column of Fire at Christmas, and so since then I've been working on a new story. I hesitate to say much about it because I'm still at the stage where I could change my mind about it and do something else. It did happen to me once that I worked on a story for a year and then realized that it wasn't going to work out. So if you don't mind, I won't say too much about my next book until I'm absolutely sure that that's what I'm going to write. Well, then I have to ask you this question, though. Do you want to go back more to the roots, or are you enjoying staying this historical kind of atmosphere you've recreated now? Well, I enjoy this very much. And I think I will do another historical novel next. But it is important if you have if you're a creative person over a long period of time, you've got to be careful not to start repeating yourself. You've got to keep an eye on that. So maybe one of these days I'll do what I did when I wrote The Pillars of the Earth and write something that nobody is expecting. I'm not saying definitely, but the idea kind of tempts me. Well, here you go, buddy. You know, spying takes a lot of courage. Breaking out of the mold of the way the publishing companies want to put you, that takes a lot of nerve, too. You'd be a great spy. Yep. Nice to talk to you. It was such a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you. Good luck with this one. It's terrific. Bye-bye. Thanks. Bye-bye. I've been speaking with best-selling author Ken Follett. His latest book is A Column of Fire. For information on the book and Ken Follett, visit his website at ken-follett.com. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, a production of Resec, LLC. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show posts new podcasts Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern. Visit hallicasser-jayne.com.